All right, thank you very much for that generous introduction and for the invitation. Also for all the other lovely talks that I had the opportunity to participate in as an audience member. Even the fairly critical roastings of my previous work. I hope to have something by way of response to some of those lovely remarks. So what I'm going to do today, just make sure. Is it changing? It's not changing. I'm going to do today is I'm going to try to figure out how to change these slides. Okay. All right. Good job. All right. I'm going to give a little bit of background to how I got interested in the project that I'll discuss today. It basically came to my attention from a phenomenon that came on the radar of a lot of philosophers of race, as well as human biologists working in the area in the early 2000s. I call it the mapping phenomenon. There's a philosophical question that's generated from observing that phenomenon. I'll talk about some motivations for why folks would want to address this question. Some of it does have to do with philosophy of medicine. I'll give my sort of answer to the question, my thesis, present the argument, clarify key terms in the argument, defend the premises, and then trying to point out some implications for race theory by way of a new way of doing race theory and see how that bleeds into lessons that we can apply to the racial health disparities problem. So this work will be forthcoming in a book I'm currently working on for Oxford University Press, A Pluralist Solution to the Race Problem. So it starts shortly after I graduate from Stanford, where I got my PhD, as well as a master's in biology. I came back on a fellowship to actually write a different book that was called No Space for Race, The Philosophical Foundations of Biological Racial Anti-Realism. Lots of philosophers, especially social constructionists, were very much looking forward to me publishing this book. Unfortunately, it never came out. And it never came out because I bumped into Noah Rosenberg, a population geneticist at Stanford, who was teaching a course on advanced human population genetics. And he was actually teaching some of my stuff at the course. And I asked to sit in on the course, and he said, yeah, sure, of course, we're reading your stuff. I was like, great, come on in. And that course basically changed my perspective. So I'll go into what exactly sort of jumped off in that course and the phenomenon that arose from reading the literature in that course and an answer to a question that rose from the course. So first off, what is population genetics? This is a part of biology where we are studying both genetics at the population level as well as evolutionary biology. So populations are kind of the units of evolution, not the only units, but a very important unit. So if you're going to do population genetics, you might want to find out your populations. So there's a basic project in population genetics called population structure analysis. And that's just basically the task of identifying one or more levels of biological populations in a larger biological group, usually a species, but not always. So yeah, if you want to do population genetics, this is something that you've got to engage in. And there are different ways of thinking about biological populations and population genetics. But the two main ones, as identified by the philosopher of biology, Lisa Gannett from Canada, are breeding units and genealogical units. So you can be in a population from breeding relations or genealogical relations. In the past, the way that population geneticists would sort organisms into populations was according to a method called distance-based genetic clustering. So basically, you'd have your sort of lowest unit of clustering, a lot of times a local panmictic unit, randomly mating group of organisms. And you do a pairwise analysis to see which ones are genetically most similar to the others. Of course, predicated on an assumption that genetic similarity is going to be corresponding to past reproductive behavior. And you invoke a method of clustering similar groups. You average the resulting clusters, and you keep going until you are done. This is an example of a pretty popular result of distance-based genetic clustering from the 1990s. Yes, that is the 1900s for the newer generation. That was when I was a high school student and college student, not that far ago. And this is from a classic population genetics text, The History and Geography of Human Genes by Cavalli-Sorza et al. Cavalli-Sorza actually was a noted population geneticist at Stanford, although I didn't overlap with him when I was there. It just gives a little information on sort of the input of the method, and the output would be a hierarchy of sort of crisp genetic clusters. There was no such thing as having mixed groups of organisms in your clusters. And of course, this is an example where they're sampling people from the human species. There are a lot of drawbacks, though, with that method. In the first opening pages of that book, they said, well, the method's not really going to work that well for abundantly mixed groups of people like African Americans, which I am a proud member of. You literally have to keep those sorts of populations out of the analysis in order for the analysis to work well. Might there be a way of identifying population structure in a species that acknowledges kind of subtle mixed groups of organisms as populations? Yes, and that method was developed at Stanford while I was there, actually. It's called model-based genetic clustering. This is a different sort of method where you start with organisms themselves, not some lower level groups of organisms, and you use genotype data directly, and you use a clustering algorithm in some kind of clustering software to try to find what sort of sorting where you allow individuals in each cluster to have graded memberships. You can have membership from basically 0% to 100% in a particular cluster at a level that really sort of maximizes the probability of observing the genotypes that you put into the software, right? The first method was a abundantly Bayesian method, but you have frequentists and other types of probabilistic methods today. You can keep doing this. You might not get a stable result at a level. It's not guaranteed. There are lots of species where this would fail for. There are, I think, cuttlefish, European cuttlefish, are a single panmictic population. So you wouldn't get any substructure. But you might be able to get some in humans. Before I go into that, I'll give a little more of a history to this software, the structure software. It was invented specifically by Jonathan Pritchard et al. At Stanford in 2000. It was the first, but there are plenty more software programs that are used to do this kind of so-called fuzzy, or they call it model-based genetic clustering to identify population structure and species. Noah Rosenberg, the gentleman whose course I was in, was the first author of the first study to use this software on humans. And that happened in Marcus Feldman's lab. Full disclaimer, Marcus Feldman was my master's thesis advisor at Stanford. I worked in a different lab, but he was my thesis advisor. He actually had an interest in race theory for an unfortunate historical reason. One of his colleagues at Stanford, William Shockley, who won a Nobel Prize in physics. Shockley might be a familiar name to people who do philosophy of physics. decided to spend his twilight years as a professor defending the intellectual inferiority of Blacks compared to whites using IQ. This is not how I would recommend spending your twilight years as a professor, completely jumping outside your area of expertise as a physicist into biology, and then defending something that's blatantly racist. So Feldman felt an obligation to educate him a little bit on population genetics, and that's originally how he got interested in race theory. Since then, he's been a big advocate of interdisciplinary work between the philosophy department and the Department of Biology at Stanford in terms of at least race theory, but also philosophy of biology, other philosophy of science issues. Okay, so let's get to the results of the classic Rosenberg et al. Study. This is the result that everyone kind of paid attention to in the early 2000s when the study was published. You got what looked like some evidence for different levels of population structure represented as genetic clustering structure, which isn't automatically the same thing. We'll get into that in a little bit, in the human species. This was the most popularly cited paper in the journal Science for at least 3 years. Predictably, philosophers of science didn't start really paying attention to it until after that. You know, there were some philosophers of race that did find these results interesting. First off, how are we supposed to interpret the results? Take one of these levels, say k equals 6, that's just the number of clusters that were identified from the software. The way you're supposed to understand the results is the following. So each non-Black vertical line, so maybe this orange one here, is supposed to represent an organism in the sample. The Black vertical lines, they don't represent any organism, they just separate the different putative local populations. It's a hypothesis that's what is being separated as local population. They usually collect these data with some other sort of method, and it's tested whether this forms a population later. The color dimension is your genetic cluster dimension, which may or may not represent a biological population, right? You might have very coarse sampling, and you just get a genetic clustering because of the sample. There's not really anything there. But sometimes you can get actual population structure identified. Now, the way that you understand the degree of membership in one of these clusters is as the degree of genomic ancestry that someone gets from the cluster. So literally, they're taking the proportion of alleles that were identified in the sample, however alleles being defined. Sometimes it's a single nucleotide sort of sequence at a time. Sometimes a cluster of nucleotides called microsatellites and other sorts of things. Depending on how that is, what percentage of those did you get from that group divided by the total that you have in your genome. So that gets you a precise calculation of both your genomic ancestry from the group as well as your degree of membership with this sort of fuzzy notion of population. So the Americans immediately recognized the little hidden joke here. So we are on the precipice of a potential second Donald Trump election in the United States. I apologize. I will make sure to get back in time to vote next Tuesday in my very important swing state of Pennsylvania. But the first time he was running for president, he went up against multiple Democratic candidates, one of which was a senator from Massachusetts, Elizabeth Warren. Now, she claimed that she was part Native American. And in fact, the Harvard University claimed that she was the first Native American professor hired in the School of Law. Okay. Now, she claimed that she had some Cherokee and Delaware, I believe, indigenous ancestry. That was the basis of her claim. Trump said, prove it, do a DNA test. I'm not sure who her political advisor was, but she did it. And she opened up a website, which I downloaded everything from the website. Website no longer exists. And she gave her report. That is her report. I did the calculation myself in the United States. There was a lot of CNN, Fox News, all these news agencies were trying to get the calculation right. But it's about 0.2%. According to the clustering result that was done by a different Stanford professor, Carlos Bustamante, in the School of Medicine, using a different algorithm from structure, but very similar to structure. Now, my opinion on this as a philosopher of science, those results are completely within the measurement error of this technology. So I want to see her do it again and again before trusting any of these results. But no one called me up and asked. All right. So that's how you understand the results. What was so interesting about these results to geneticists and philosophers and other race theorists who were keeping a close eye? Well, at the time, these results look like there was a one-to-one mapping, at least at the level where you identified 5 genetic clusters of humans, to what I'll call the 1997 Office of Management Budget racial scheme, which is a very popular and widely used racial scheme to this day in the United States. Why did this look obvious to population geneticists? We'll talk about that a little bit later with respect to the largest funder of health research in the United States, National Institutes of Health, actually mandates that samples are stratified in this way with respect to race in NIH-funded clinical studies, according to a law 1993 and an order from the NIH agency. So this is, a racial scheme that population geneticists who are funded by the NIH United States were very familiar with, and they said, hey, this looks like there's a one-to-one mapping to at least the K=5 level of substructure. Because they're population geneticists, they like to be very quantitative. So this is an example of one of many interdisciplinary studies between population geneticists and sociologists, showing that it's not just sort of an eyeball effect. You can blind yourself to a random sample of Americans who self-report their race in the OMB's racial scheme and predict their genetic results with 99% accuracy. You can blind yourself to the genetic results and predictor self-reports with the same level of accuracy. So this is statistically significant. It's high. There is a presumable one-to-one mapping. The question then becomes, given that this is sort of a set theoretic way of representing a one-to-one mapping, what's the metaphysical relation that's exemplified in the mapping, right? So, a way of getting your mind around this, if I just named each of these the same, Native American, East Asian, that would be representing identity very clearly. But there could be other sorts of relations that are represented by this particular mapping. It's not obvious that it's identity or something else. So in the philosophy of race literature, philosophers stepped up to the plate and generated some potential hypotheses for what's going on. Some of them that I'll talk about today are theories of coextension, maybe the terms that the US government was using and the terms that population geneticists were using were picking out the same groups, but the terms have different meanings, right? So they're picking out different things, but maybe they're picking out the same groups of things. And these are other sort of the highlighted ones or other sort of metaphysical relations that could be exemplified. Now, a practical importance of answering this question is that, as I said before, this is a racial scheme that lots of NIH-funded clinical researchers, and then what I've learned here, researchers in Europe, because they tend to collaborate with American researchers and want that sweet, sweet American funding for their health science. Money really does control a lot in medical research. They're familiar with this racial scheme as well, and it might be useful to get a good idea of what essentially races are in this racial scheme. Okay, so what is my answer to the question? I actually believe the right way to think about the relation is identity. I think what geneticists actually did was they found out what the groups actually were that the government was talking about in the United States since 1997. Now, this is a fancy, sort of way of putting what I'm talking about when I talk about identity. It's pretty much for the professional philosophers in the audience. But what I'll do now is I'll just, sort of outline my argument and then dig into some defenses of the premises. So it's a straightforward sort of modus ponens. If it's the case that in this particular race talk, the race terms that are used pick out as not just their reference, but as their meanings, and I'll get to a clarification of what I mean by that. The actual human continental populations, as I'll call them, that they stand in a one-to-one mapping to, if that's the case, and if it's also the case that in this particular race talk, the first set of claims is true in the antecedent, and the second set of claims is true in the antecedent, my identity thesis will follow by logical inference. Okay, so what are some of the key terms that are used in the argument? I, of course, am not assuming that people in Britain are familiar with what the US government has been doing in terms of its official race talk for over 2 decades now. So here's a stab at that. So in the US government, it's broken up into 3 parts. The part that handles executing the law and making sure that the will of the legislative branch and the judicial branch gets respected among the American people is the executive branch. And in the executive branch, the Office of Management Budget, which is the largest office in that branch, kind of has a unique power to tell all the other offices in the executive branch what to do, especially with respect to statistical policy. This is an example of how this race talk shows up in sort of everyday life of Americans. This was my sort of new hire paperwork. It's not really paper, it's online. The provost sent it to me after, I got hired. Interestingly, Elizabeth Warren used to be a Penn professor in the School of Law, and she also filled out this form. I haven't got my hands on the exact boxes that she marked, but I think we can guess. How did this race talk start? According to the Office of Management Budget, before 1977, the federal agencies were kind of just doing their own thing. The Department of Justice had its own sort of race talk. Health and Human Affairs had its own race talk and so forth. And it was kind of a mess. And so they took it upon themselves. This was when Bill Clinton was in office, I believe, to make an executive order, presidential directive, kind of operates like an executive order, to mandate that you have to follow this new directive when you're collecting or reporting racial data among the other federal agencies. This is a very rare thing in the world. I've done, a study myself to check this result from the sociologist Anne Morning. There's fewer than 20 UN countries that have official racial schemes across the globe. The United States is definitely one of them, though. So what is the directive claim? It doesn't actually require that the federal agencies use the OMB's racial scheme, whatever that scheme is. It requires that it's translatable. Whatever racial scheme they use is translatable into their racial scheme when they're collecting and reporting racial data to other federal agencies. In practice, usually the federal agencies just go ahead and use the OMB's racial scheme, and they require that of private companies and so forth that want to get federal funding, or researchers and so forth. Why they did this? Well, we had a race talk from 77 to 97. The OMB claimed that they wanted to make things more consistent and enforce the civil rights laws that folks like Martin Luther King Jr. was able to push through in the 60s. If you want to enforce, say, racial discrimination that's unlawful in mortgage lending, you might want to have some federal standard of what race talk is on mortgage lending applications. And we in fact do. 95+% of our mortgage lending applications include the Office of Management Budget's racial scheme. They changed it in 97 because of immigration and interracial sort of replications. That might seem a little strange, but some groups weren't sort of included. So the way that we thought about American Indians back then in the 70s and 80s, it only applied to people with North American indigenous ancestry. So you can come to the United States, say be 100% Mayan Mexican, and you have no race. Right? So there was a need for an update in that respect. And then Americans were having a lot of interracial kids, and that was causing a problem because before you had to choose exactly one race. No such thing as mixed. I remember that from high school. We had one sort of mixed kid in school. We were always trying to see, gonna choose black or white this year. I don't know what's gonna happen. Because we actually had to we had to say it out loud. It was a very different time. All right. Interestingly, Hispanics were classified as an ethnicity, not a race. Now, these are the so-called definitions that the Office of Management Budget rolled out. There's been a recent change of these, which I'll talk about in a minute. But let's take a little gander at what's going on first. It looks like some kind of continental ancestry thing with some social political stuff in some of the groups to some extent. The Center for Disease Control has its own sort of alphanumeric code for sort of classifying the ethnic groups into the racial groups here. So that's where I'm getting those data from. Now I'll say this is interesting for a philosopher of race because philosophers of race who have worked on the US government's race talk, nobody believes that the so-called definitions, these descriptions, are actually constituting the semantic content of the terms, right? So what do I mean by that? Why wouldn't someone think that those descriptions constitute the definitions? Well, there are certain biological facts that we know pretty well, like the out-of-Africa theory of human migration history. We left Africa in two large waves of sub-Saharan Africa many, many years ago. Kind of long story short, the only people that don't have any ancestry from, I'm sorry, the only people that have only ancestry from sub-Saharan Africa are people who ancestors never left. People who are, as far back as they can remember, their ancestors from, say, South Africa, something like that. That's not the large majority of human beings in the earth because of colonization activities by many European countries. So take the description of white people according to the 1997 OMB racial scheme. These will be people with origins in Europe, Middle East, North Africa. That actually applies to all East Asians, all Native Americans, all Pacific Islanders. It's not picking out the right group of people, right? It's not the right description. So this is not an uncommon view among philosophers of race. So there is some theory that needs to be done to figure out what exactly are the meanings of these terms. Now, I did say there was a recent change in March of this year due to some empirical work trying to figure out how best to get more Americans to respond to the race question on federal surveys. The OMB wrote out its 2024 official racial scheme, which they plan to require by 2029 before the next federal census. Until then, we're still using the 1997, so it's still fair to talk about it. In fact, it's unclear that the new racial scheme won't get rescinded because this racial scheme was supposed to be rolled out in 2017 after Obama left office and Trump got elected. But whatever Obama had in plan, Trump just rolled back. So we'll see if he wins, and if he wins, what happens. All right. So we're still using currently the 1997 racial scheme. It's still a widely used racial scheme in the United States. It is by far the most popularly used racial scheme on college applications, for example. 99% of college applications that are ranked in the U.S. News and World Report uses this racial scheme exactly. And that's for a very simple reason tied to funding. If you want to get funding from the Department of Education, you need to collect these data because they need to make sure that you're not discriminating unlawfully against people based on race. Who doesn't want funding from the Department of Education? So that's how you get, all this widespread use of this race talk. And in fact, we had a very famous Supreme Court decision that made consideration of race unlawful in college admissions, which was something that we were doing since 1978. There were different reasons for why people wanted to remove it. But in any case, because of the Department of Education reporting requirements, the universities that were using this kind of language before in application are still using it. They're just blinding that information to admissions officers when they're making their admissions decisions. And there's been some litigation claiming that some folks don't believe that admissions officers are genuinely blinded from that information. So we're going to be continuing to talk about this racial scheme for many years to come. Okay, so the human continental populations themselves, what actually are they? I have a paper on this in the Journal of Philosophy of Science. They're a very specific form of biological population that I call K populations. Roughly every sort of temporal part, every sort of time slice of groups of organisms in such a population form a fuzzy set where you get membership in the set. If it's a long time since the group has evolved, then just from your genealogical relationship to the group, but the population starts as a breeding group. It's kind of a unique kind of biological population, combination of breeding and genealogical. So this is, just some more details about it here. Interestingly, population geneticists have done hordes and hordes of research trying to precisely identify the average degree of genomic ancestry of various ethnic groups in these human continental populations. Now, is there a reason for thinking that this level of human genetic clustering actually forms a biologically real level of human population structure? I think there is. I have lots of work sort of trying to defend that. This is a sort of quick snapshot of it. If you had a theory of biological reality for classifications or entities where a sufficient condition for being biologically real is to be warranted to explain or predict observational regularities or laws in well-ordered scientific research programs in biology, of which population genetics would certainly be one, then you could identify the sort of reality status as biologically real of the human continental population level as explaining the robust genetic clustering results that we get when we try to cluster humans into 5 groups. There's no guarantee that that's going to work. And in fact, I have some results if anyone wants to talk about this in the Q&A. It's extremely unclear that we have any other levels of population structure besides K equals 3, K equals 5, and of course the local population level. More work needs to be done. But we're fairly certain that we do have a level of population structure at K equals 5. So these are some studies here. Population geneticists are so confident about this, you actually can see Rosenberg et al.'s results included in popular population genetics textbooks across the world. Okay, so what do I mean by meaning? Here, I'm talking about this in the referential semantics tradition and philosophy of language. Basically, roughly, philosophy of language study things like what is meaning. There's a tradition in there when you think of meaning as the contribution that a term makes to the truth conditions of the propositions in which the term occurs. It's like a truth conditional notion of meaning. It's a sort of meaning we use in math and logic. But when you care about whether the sentence that a term is used in comes out to be true or false, this is the sort of standard of meaning that turns out to be pretty helpful. In this tradition, they typically think of meanings as descriptions that uniquely pick out the referent of the term, the intended referent of the term, or as the referent itself, right? So it's interesting, if you haven't been sort of up on what's been going on in recent philosophy of language, might seem a little odd, but it's a very popular way of thinking about meaning. All I'm doing is helping myself to that paradigm in my argument, the paradigm of referential semantics. Okay, so let's defend the premises. The first one I kind of just structured to be true analytically. the consequence just follows from how I'm defining things like singular term brings out single thing for the term, so forth. A little bit more interesting is why would anyone think that the OMB's 1997 raised terms are singular terms? Well, I think we can get motivation for that empirically from Directive Number 15 itself. I mean, remember, one of the primary reasons that they gave for wanting to control the race talk of the federal government was because there's too much crosstalk, right? So if you use a description instead of a referent, actually, I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit, but if you thought of the referent of these terms as not singular terms, that really wouldn't get rid of the ambiguity. Right? Okay. The more substantive one is why I think that the meanings of the OMB's 1997 race terms are simply reference, and those reference being the human continental populations that they stand in a one-to-one mapping to. The sort of strategy I'm going to use to defend this is an empirical abduction. I'm going to say, hey, there are two ways of thinking about the meanings of these terms, referential or non-referential, and then you can think about another way of classifying the meanings is biological or non-biological meanings. I'm, of course, going to be defending, my hypothesis is defending the biological referential sort of box here, but there are other philosophers that I think have pretty strong race theories that could be competitors, like Michael Levin's. Michael Hardiman's would be a non-referential biological account. Paul Taylor from UCLA would have a non-referential, non-biological, and then Asta from, I think she's at Duke now, would have a referential, non-biological social constructions account. I don't have time to talk about why I think none of these accounts adequately capture the meanings of the OMB's 1997 race terms. I will, however, go through two examples, Asta's and Hardiman's, because I want to get on to the race and medicine stuff. So here's my sample of the defenses. Let's take Asta's theory. She has a very widely cited book in philosophy of race that she published in 2018 that tries to give a social constructionist account of race in two, kind of popular contexts. One is formal race talk, and specifically, she talks about the 1997 OMB race talk. She's a recent immigrant to recent, she's been there for a while, but she's an immigrant to the United States. She grew up in Iceland, and she, personally, from immigration, the immigration experience, had to interact with this race talk a lot, right? So it's no surprise that she would be kind of interested in figuring out what this talk is actually about. She thinks it's about a special kind of social kind that she calls a social kind that is constituted essentially by conferred social essences. The way that she kind of makes the case for this in her book is with an example with strike in baseball. I tried to convince her to use basketball, but it's like, if you really want to be American, use basketball. But she used baseball, it's fine. Said, okay, what is a strike? We've all seen a baseball game, and we've been extremely disappointed with what's been counted as a strike. But officially, the umpire gets to call what a strike is, right? A strike is not some kind of magical, well, not magical, but some kind of specific physical trajectory of the projectile through space, right? That would be lovely if it were, but that's not what it is. Instead, she says that the essence of a strike in baseball is one of those physical trajectories of a baseball that's conferred the status of a strike by a legitimate umpire in a legitimate baseball game, right? So this is how she would think about what's going on with the US government's race talk here. What is essential about being Black or Asian or so forth in this race talk is that the federal government confers you a certain status in the racial scheme. And what might look like a geographic ancestry basis for being in the racial scheme is actually just what that race talk is tracking. So this is a new metaphysical relation she introduces called the tracking relation, also called base properties like geographic ancestry in this case. So she thinks that the relation that's exemplified by the mapping phenomenon is some kind of function of tracking, not identity. Okay, so let's test it. I don't think that this theory works. It works nicely for some of the race terms, but not for a particular one, namely American Indian. Here's a test. If she's right about the essence of American Indian, then it should be the case that it's not possible to be a member of the American Indian race without federally recognized tribal affiliation. Also actually says that this is the case. This is the quote where I'm getting it from in chapter 5 of her book. My theory, of course, federal tribal affiliation is not required to be American Indian in this race talk. All you need is to have the right kind of continental ancestry. So mestizo Hispanic Americans, for example, would be American Indian to some extent, partially, right? As well as official tribal members, according to the United States. But the question is, what does the United States think? We can get a test of this from looking at how the Census Bureau actually counts Americans during federal censuses, at least during the ones where the race talk in question has been in effect. And we can see that instead of not counting the self-reports of Americans who write in that they're American Indian, but they don't put in any federal tribal affiliation, they created new language and they said, hey, we'll call these individuals who call themselves Mexican American Indians, Mexican American Indians. And in fact, they're one of the largest groups of American Indians in the United States, according to the US government. And you might think, well, that's a little weird. I thought the United States just accepted your self-reports. That's false. Millions of Americans have the self-reports rejected every census count. And in fact, it's usually done by a computer program. And when that program fails, they use people, professors from certain universities. I want to get that invite one day. That will be fun. All right, here's another attempt. Michael Hardiman from UC San Diego. He has a non-referential biological account of race, not just for the US government, but also for ordinary English race talk as such. So he has a much broader race theory, but it includes the specific race talk that I'm focusing on. And he specifically says it includes it in his recent book, Rethinking Race from 2017. So what does he think essentially a race is in ordinary English discourse? He calls them minimalist races. And he has 3 conditions, 3 necessary descriptions that apply to you if you're a race, and they are sufficient. This is all you need to be a race, according to Hardiman, in at least ordinary English. So you distinguish from one another by patterns of visible physical features of the face, skin, and hair. You are constituted, you have a common shared ancestry among the people of the group, and you have a distinctive geographic origin. Hardiman, in chapter 4 of his book, explicitly says Quayshawn Spencer is wrong. I love to see those kind of engagements with my work. Identity is not the right relation to talk about here. Instead, co-exemplification. So he says, well, it's not the case that the OMB's Black, for example, is just means the Black African population. Rather, what's going on is both Black and Black African are minimalist races. That's what he says in the book. Clever response. Of course, I'm going to disagree, and I'm going to test whether his theory is a better account than mine with another test sentence. Take the one, it's not possible that the Pacific Islander race does not satisfy C1. Of course, this is not possible for Hardiman. You can't be a race, at least in ordinary English, if you don't satisfy the first condition. Of course, according to my theory, it is possible to have a Pacific Islander race or any of the OMB's races to not satisfy the first condition of the visible physical similarity. And one way you can generate this possibility is with a little possible world here. Say Homo sapiens undergoes a bottleneck, and the only people that are left are sub-Saharan Africans and Melanesians. Don't worry, we're not planning anything. This is just a hypothetical. Sometimes philosophers pick on babies. I'm just picking on the whole species. So this is a sort of Black Homo sapiens world. It's not too far away because this is what the species looked like hundreds of thousands of years ago. So you have sub-Saharan Africans and Melanesian folk who are very hard to tell the difference between on anthropological criteria like skin pigmentation range, curliness of hair, and so forth. All right. My question is, what does the OMB think? And we can again use the CDC or the US Census Bureau as a proxy because they follow the OMB's directions. And we can see that the way that Melanesians are counted, they're not counted as Black people, even though they look like Black people. They're counted as Pacific Islanders. And if you're interested, Hardiman has a reply to my reply, and he says, I give up. It's a paper from 2022. He says Pacific Islanders is just not a minimalist race. It's always nice to see that coming to the light. Okay, so a little snapshot of what's going on with the other defenses. Michael Levin has kind of a joint descriptivist referentialist account of what race is in ordinary English. Given what the referential content's supposed to be, it's kind of a strict biological category. And it turns out that all but one OMB race isn't going to count as a race in his system. So that's not going to work. Paul Taylor has a social constructionist theory of race, but that's actually going to also fail for Pacific Islander because that group is way too visibly divergent to count as a radically constructed race according to his race theory. So if all that works, we have found that what the US government is actually talking about with this racial scheme is the human continental populations. So the identity thesis would go through. How does this apply to philosophy of race in general? Well, in the last, since the 90s, philosophers of race have basically divvied up the theoretical terrain in these three different ways, although there's four technical possibilities. The first is actually biological anti-realism. So the view that what race is essentially is biological, but given what that essence is, it's not real. So Anthony Appiah, the Ghanaian British American philosopher, was very big proponent of that in the early 90s. And these are some more recent installments. Adam Hochman, I think, is still currently defending this view today. Oops. And then next up is biological realism. What race is essentially is, again, has a biological essence, but it's actually real. So Lucius Outlaw at Vanderbilt, I think he's retired now, but he worked there for most of his career, had kind of like a biosocial view. There's a little bit of social, cultural, political elements to race, but there's also some biological elements that has to do with breeding and so forth. I was actually part of this camp in the earlier part of my career, but as you'll see soon, I've given this up. And then you have a very popular option, probably more popular outside of philosophy, but still relatively good popularity within philosophy. The non-biological realists say race actually doesn't have a biological essence at all, but it's still real. Naomi Zack was a big proponent of this in the early 90s, but the late, great Charles Mills recently passed away. He was also a big proponent of that in the 90s, and you could find multiple examples of this in outside of philosophy departments, like Dorothy Roberts at my institution in the law school, and sociology and Africana studies is in this camp as well. There's some variations. Some people think that the essence of what race is a socio-political construct. Some people think it's a cultural construct. Now, technically, there's another option. You could be a non-biological anti-realist. I haven't seen anyone publish on this. If you want a publication, you can get started. It's a possibility. Just give me an acknowledgement in the paper. So how does my work today figure into this longer debate in philosophy of race about what race is and whether it exists. Well, if the identity of these is true, we have an example of a widely used ordinary race talk where the meanings of the race terms are referenced. But this isn't the only way, presumably, that Americans are talking about race, and certainly not the only way that we talk about race throughout the globe. So then there would be at least two. So now we have what I think deserves a new name. I call it racial pluralism. This is when you claim that what race is, plurality of things, or the existence status for race might have a plurality of existence statuses. I'm of course going to give this a more careful defense in the book, but the other prominent theories in the literature I would classify as monist theories because they're saying that race has a single sort of essence, whether it's socially constructed or biological or whatever. I'm saying that that is fundamentally mistaken. So an example of how one might think about this, say you had the question, well, who are Asians essentially? When I'm talking about the Asian race, what am I talking about? There are some contexts where it's a sort of fuzzy continental population group where South Asians and East Asians are to some extent largely representatives of the group. But then there might be other contexts where we're talking about sort of a visible group. And this would include not just East Asians, but also Polynesians, Micronesians, but not include South Asians. So this is, here are some contexts in which these two realities could obtain. The first would be the context that I've been talking about today, where you have Asians turning out to be a continental population, including East Asians and South Asians. But then you have other contexts, say in the United States and probably elsewhere. I think Canada is a good example, where the anti-Asian hate speech context, especially during the COVID-19 pandemic, when people were unfortunately harassing and in some cases unlawfully harassing Asian folk. Who were they harassing? Well, we actually have some good data on that in the United States. The Stop AAPI Hate National Report. This is from the sort of peak of the COVID-19 pandemic. If you look in the report, you see a lot of Polynesians and Micronesians getting attacked in being called sort of the cause of the pandemic, all that sort of racist language, but not so much South Asians, right? Interesting side note. I gave this talk, a version of it, in Dallas before, and I didn't realize that the example was from Dallas, and they thought I was sort of being, I wasn't trying to disrespect them. It's just Dallas apparently is very racist. I don't know. All right. So how can we apply these results to the healthcare context? In recent years, I've been interested in addressing the so-called racial health disparities problem and exploring the extent to which pluralism might be able to help us with that problem. So first, I'll say a bit about what that problem is, and then how I think that racial pluralism can help us solve this problem. So first, what is a racial health disparity? Not just a statistically significant difference in health between one human race and one or more other existing human race, so black and white or white, non-white, something like that, but a medically significant, right? There's some kind of underlying causal, biological causal, epidemiological causal, some sort of underlying reason for why that difference exists. So if we want to solve this problem, presumably we're going to want to eradicate all of the racial health disparities that ought to be eradicated. And we're, of course, going to want to eradicate it in a morally permissible way. I'm actually working on this project with a former student, and we were trying to come up with how to think about this problem. And I threw in this last part. He said, well, why did you throw that in? It's like, well, you can always get rid of racial health disparities by just, killing a lot of people, but that's not the way that we want to do it, right? All right. So here's an observation. Lots of bioethicists and philosophers of medicine who focus on this issue focus more on the how should we sort of eradicate all racial health disparities that ought to be eradicated part of the problem. But I want to think more about what would constitute eradicating all racial disparities that ought to be eradicated. So presumably, you're going to want to at least identify the racial health disparities that are a target for eradication. So at least the statistical population, you could ideally want an entire list, but you could figure out whether you're done by, say, representatively sampling from the population and always getting no racial health disparities. That's fine. But then at least in order to identify the population, you got to know which racial health disparities are candidates for being part of the population. If there are biological racial discourses throughout the world, you need to be looking at those discourses to see if there are any racial health disparities among the races in those discourses. In the United States, I've hopefully identified one, and we can make a case for this being, if there are any racial health disparities among, say, Asians and Blacks or whites and Asians and so forth in this race talk, we ought to eradicate it kind of for legal reasons. We do have a federal law in the United States called the NIH Revitalization Act that requires that any NIH-funded medical research should be looking to see if the instrument, drug, or whatever is being produced from the research works equally well for racial minorities as it does the white majority. So here's an example of how you can do that well. Identifying a racial health disparity. Okay. So this is a sampling from, this is a study from the United States that sampled from California and Tennessee. Children who have the most widely found childhood cancer in the United States, acute lymphoblastic leukemia. So they sampled a little over 2,000 children in the United States, made it racially diverse. What was interesting about the study is how they sampled Native Americans, and they called them Native Americans. They didn't sample people with tribal affiliation, per se. That wasn't one of the conditions of being part of the sample. They sampled mestizo Hispanic children. They actually tried to test whether they had any sort of Native American ancestry using the structure algorithm. What did they find? Well, with this kind of sampling, interestingly, they found that there were medically significant relapse risks after receiving one round of chemotherapy for Native American children with acute lymphoblastic leukemia compared to non-Native American children with acute lymphoblastic leukemia, and after correcting for known confounders such as gender, age, leukocyte count at diagnosis, and so forth. An example of one of these racial disparities is there's a twofold higher risk of relapse after 2 years. Okay? So this is significant. It's very good that they sampled in this way to find this racial disparity in health. Interestingly, there was a pretty quick fix for people with the risk of relapse. They did a genome-wide association analysis on lots of so-called single nucleotide polymorphisms, kind of marking different genetic spots in the genome. And they found a couple of markers that are known to be set in a region of human genomes that are known for drug metabolizing. And they tried to find other sort of causal influences here, but this still stuck out as a significant sort of influence as well as a medically significant influence. It was tied to specifically Native American chromosome segments. How did they fix this problem? Interestingly, they just looked at the people who had these genotypes and they gave them an extra round of chemotherapy. Very quick fix. And you can look at the graph and you can see how the graph separates for Native American children with all and non-Native American children with all. Before intervention, They identify the underlying cause, difference in genotypes, graph disappears. Clean answer. Good. So we wouldn't, of course, seen that if we didn't sample. You wouldn't have the statistical power to see that statistically significant and medically significant difference. So I think that's how a pluralist account can work to improve handling the racial disparities in health problem. So a very quick sort of sell of this, we're actually already using pluralism for other things like sex and gender. This is the new patient form in Penn Medicine. I'm a Penn Medicine patient. And you'll see they give multiple opportunities to mark male or female. They give one opportunity to mark your race. All I'm asking is that we have more opportunities. All right, thank you very much. And I'll give a shout out to my researchers at Penn, Sophie Trotto and Natalina Purnell, who helped me with some of the empirical parts of the work. Thank you.
Raise your hands. When enough people, if you want to ask follow-up, you can raise your finger and the finger from the hand. Don't use the finger hand system. I can charge. So at the back, please.
And wait till you have a microphone so people online can hear.
And people might only hear me, so I have a microphone.
Okay, thanks. So I'm just curious about what kind of correlation we would expect if we're really talking about identity. And I would have thought the answer is 100%, all right? So take the correlation of white and white or Caucasian and Caucasian, like those are identical and we're gonna get 100% correlation. But between the five groups and the OMB categories, there was a very high correlation, very impressive one, but it wasn't 100%. And so I guess naively, I wondered, well, that doesn't seem sufficient for identity. It's pretty close, but it's not identity, right?
Mm-hmm. Oh, good. Excellent.
That was it.
No. I saw the hands in the air. Good. So I should clarify a little bit more of what's going on there. The correlation that was holding in that interdisciplinary study with population geneticists and sociologists on the OMB race talk and the continental population memberships was about self-reported OMB race talk, right? And remember, that's a measurement of your racial membership, not constituting your racial membership. No philosopher of race who studied this carefully thinks that, right? So if you're doing a measurement, you could have error in your measurement, right? Just like a thermometer that's measuring the temperature in this room. Sometimes they're off, sometimes they're on. Hopefully they're on more than they're off, right? So the disconnects there can be easily explained by to what extent the self-reporting is actually matching the continental ancestry, and we see different patterns. We have people, so some of these continental populations in certain social contexts, people have to have pretty high sort of continental ancestry in order to feel like they belong to the group. Doesn't mean you don't belong. That's not the metaphysical standard of whether you belong. But that could account for any measurement differences, if that helps.
No, that is, thanks.
Thank you. That was really interesting. I like the pluralism idea. I just want to understand it a bit better. So is the pluralism compatible with, say, the claim that some race talk can be best explained in terms of biological anti-realism and some race talk can be best explained in terms of non-biological realism? And is the pluralism also compatible with the idea that, so take someone like, I don't know, maybe Aslanger, right? Saying that Yeah, whatever. I mean, maybe there is the race talk you're talking about. Maybe it's important. Maybe it's important in medicine. But if you want to understand racism, and if you're an activist in pursuit of social justice, then that's not the kind of race talk you should be focusing on. The kind of race talk you should be focusing on is the one that is best explained in terms of non-biological realism, the social categories, and so on. So is your pluralism kind of consistent with all these claims?
Oh, oh, yeah, absolutely consistent. I'm a job creator. So the US government itself, I think, is probably producing a pluralist sort of atmosphere for race talk for Americans. The 1997 to 1977 to 1996 race talk. I mean, remember, at most you can have one race, right? And there were these weird conditions for being part of the race. It's not clear that even a referential semantics, subtle population-genic account is even going to save that. I'm sympathetic to an anti-realist account for that sort of race talk. But then look at what they're doing right now with their 2024 revisions, if that holds up. It's not entirely clear which groups are the races, which are the ethnicities. They did that on purpose to get people to participate in census counts. But let's say hypothetically that Hispanic or Latino is supposed to be one of the races, right? That's definitely a cultural group, right? So that wouldn't be a level of human population structure in terms of biological populations. So the US government itself could be generating a biologically real race talk, a biologically anti-realist race talk, and a social constructionist race talk.
Okay, Quayshawn, that was great. But I wasn't clear about one thing, which was the focus on the classification of the five-fold classification of the Office of Management and Budget. I mean, so I can see that that lines up very nicely with the results you get if you set the structure program to k=5. But if I set it to k=6, then presumably I'll get another classification that optimally explains the variation at the level of 6 groups. Maybe that the Asians are divided into South Asian. So is there something special about 5 as opposed to 6 or 2? Or I mean, suppose I set it to k=13 and I'd get a bunch of groups that divide the variation as well as can be done at that number. And maybe some of them aren't very familiar. They're not in any government classification or even any common sense classification, but it wouldn't seem to me that would make them any less real. So what was so special about what was so special about the k=5?
In terms of reality, nothing.
Okay.
There could be other levels of population structure in our species. I don't have a anything goes standard for biological reality, but it's not so high that you couldn't have different levels of population structure existing in our species today. Now, I will say one thing. I've gotten that question enough, but of course I have another slide here. This is from some research that Netherlands and Pernell did for me, and it'll hopefully come out in the book. We don't know how many other levels of population structure we have. k=3 comes out as pretty robust. It shows up in 81% of the studies. k=5 shows up in over 70%. But then at other levels, the most common ones are here, and there's lots of other alternatives. We don't know whether we break up into 6 groups. We don't know whether we break up into 7. Now, I am doing some other research with another Penn student to actually, when you don't sort of see the sort of clarity that you want and you're an empirically trained philosopher of science, you can just do the science. So I have, copy of structure. I have a pretty large sample of human genomes at this point from publicly available resources. And I'm going to do some clustering that can sort out sort of what's going on at these different levels, right?
So what are there's some kind of measure of how much variation is being explained by the groupings down the right.
So what's going on here is these are the most popular sort of subdivisions at these different K levels. So this is the by far most popular one at k=3. At k=2, there's 2 that are kind of in a tie. You might think, well, isn't it supposed to be blacks and everyone else? We don't know that yet, right? So it's interesting empirically here what's going on. K equals 4, this is the most popular one. You get lots of other solutions with different sorts of algorithms across the literature. K equals 6, this is the most popular one, but it doesn't even hit a third of replication and so forth. All right.
I've got one question in the audience, and after, oh, is that a finger? Ah, we have a finger. After the finger, we have a question online. But fingers first.
Hi, I just have a comment on the K levels. So one of my friends is Ginger and they're supposed to come today, but they couldn't. I think the K levels kind of erase Gingers from Europeans, because I know she told me that when she goes to the doctor, sometimes they need 5 levels, 5 times the amount of anesthesia that other Europeans get. And I think the race theory and racial health disparity doesn't really cover that population. And I think based on Hardeman's race theory, I think gingers kind of fulfill all 3 criteria of face, skin, color, and like common features. So do you have any suggestions on how we can improve like racial health disparity in that regard?
Sure. Forgive my ignorance. What is a ginger?
Red hair.
Oh, red hair. Okay. I grew up in a almost entirely Black neighborhood. People didn't have red hair. So yes, and I think that would have to do with what the pluralism would recommend people do in other countries, right? Don't just focus on what the US is doing. Do your own studies to see what sort of dominant race talk is prevalent in your country. And if there are those distinctions that can be captured by some, maybe Hardeman's race theory, maybe Haslanger's or so forth, then that's how you should stratify your samples for what might be relevant, addressing relevant racial disparities in health.
The US as well.
Aren't there people with red hair in the US?
Now that I know what that group is, yes, but that doesn't mean that they exist as a race, right? So for example, at the conference, we had some lovely presentations. Somebody gave a presentation that Eastern Europeans are racialized in their particular country. There might have been a time when that was the case in the United States. That's not the case today. You would fit in very well. Get yourself a ticket to the US. You will be treated lovely as a white person.
So we next have somebody joining us online. Is it David Sparrett? Please go ahead. Make sure you unmute yourself.
Yes, I have. Am I audible?
Yes.
Okay. Thanks very much. I'm interested to know what you think about the fact that in many cases, and I'm speaking from and live in South Africa, the genetic correlations are partly the artifact of a sustained political project, right? The racialized areas of residence, explicit laws against interracial marriage, interracial sex between adults, and so forth. And so, I mean, I suppose to make this more specific, 2 thoughts. It sounds like you're saying that the correlation explains something important, but the elephant in the room is that we know the correlation was partly produced or maintained by facts that aren't genetic. And then perhaps a wrinkle on that. Would you agree that we could in principle unmake race, right? These correlations are contingent. Thank you.
Well, interesting question. I do have some colleagues in South Africa. We've had some lovely conversations about differences between America and South Africa. I'll say this. So the correlations that you're talking about, I was sort of using that as a starting point for thinking about how to explain what the mapping phenomenon is. But once you have the identity theory established, those are just, they give you information about how people self-report, but they don't constitute the racial membership conditions. Now, with respect to whether there could be some social forces involved in maintaining, sort of racial classifications, absolutely. And I think that's actually the case with human continental populations as well as probably other levels of human population structure, but certainly that one. If you think about, the history of colonization and the history of immigration laws, the history of anti-miscegenation laws, you were talking about South Africa, but we had those in the United States as well for many, many years during Jim Crow era. In fact, I didn't see a lot of large-scale sort of interracial sort of births in the United States until really 21st century. The CDC keeps data on all births, all live births in the United States. And for example, even though African Americans make up about 13% of the country, over 90%, well over 90%, 93% or so, of Black mothers who give birth have Black fathers. Now, why is that the case? Statistically, that's highly unlikely in a country that large. What sort of forces are making replication that segregated? Well, housing segregation, educational segregation. I see some Black folks in the audience. I don't see a lot. It's not where I grew up. So there's all kinds of social forces that can have a play into structuring different racial schemes, whether they're biological or not. And to the last point, could we intervene to get rid of them? I mean, I guess we could. You could try that. It's not clear to me that that's desirable. I mean, some people like being Black, why do we want to destroy the race? There's some work by one of my co-authors on What is Race, Chike Jeffers, where he tries to argue that there could be other reasons for wanting to keep around racial distinctions, even in a world where we've gotten rid of racial injustices and so forth. It could be cultural reasons, things like that. So.
Okay, yeah, thanks a lot for this. So I guess I want to push back against the identity claim about the OMB, race talk, and human continental populations. So you mentioned that the OMB is in the process of revising its race talk. Yeah. I guess in a similar piece of evidence I want to give is that similar kinds of agencies in other countries to the US have different categorizations. Doesn't this suggest that what these agencies are intending to pick out is not the human continental populations, and it just happens to be, in this case, 1997, the OMB coincidentally happened upon the same thing. So I guess that's an argument for the coextension over identity here.
Yeah, good. So here are some points against it being an accident. There was a sociologist, Kenneth Pruitt, who was at Columbia University. He was the director of the Census Bureau in 2000. And the process for making these big government changes, it's bureaucratic. There's a lot of subcommittees and representing different parts of the federal government. He was representing the Census Bureau. And he wrote a book about sort of what happened behind closed doors. And some people think that I came up with the term in one of my first papers on this. I called these groups Blumenbachian races, which is a bit of a, there was an anthropologist called Blumenbach. He had some crazy views, but the racial scheme looks kind of similar. I got that term from him. He said they were trying to pick out Blumenbachian races. Now, why would you want to pick out large continental groups of people that roughly correspond to sub-Saharan Africa, East Asia, and so forth? They were pretty clear about those reasons. They had immigration reasons, they had interbreeding reasons. But there was also some other political stuff. Like there were some other suggestions that came up from other agencies and so forth, like the Bureau of Indian Affairs and so forth. The state of Hawaii had a representative. The Hawaiian state wanted to be Native American. They wanted Native Hawaiians are a different indigenous Pacific Islander group in the United States. But the Hawaii Islands are very, very far from continental US. They were, you know, sort of have a similar history as to how they came into the United States. You know, genocide and, you know, were colonized and so forth from Americans. So, you know, they feel like they should be Native American. We were here, you know, we're indigenous Americans too. American Indians didn't like that so much. So they pushed back against that. It's like, no, you're not even on the same continent. You can have your own sort of thing. So there were internal fights. There were attempts that tried to switch what the schema was. I mean, I can go on about this, but basically there was some kind of consensus on picking out these large continental groups. That wasn't an accident.
I think the example you brought up of the leukemia relapses was really interesting, but I was wondering how a pluralist outlook on race would impact a treatment based on your perceived race. So like with pain levels, etc.
Excellent question. Different scholars have been talking about that during a conference. I haven't really given that much thought. I think it's a really interesting, important question to explore. And we could divvy up the sort of how or whether to use race in medicine issue into an educational part. How should we train healthcare professionals and so forth? What should we put in medical textbooks and so forth? There's a research part, right? How should we design experiments? How should we conduct experiments? There's a clinical part that has at least two parts, diagnosis and then also treatment. Now, it's not clear to me that just because you can have good empirical reasons for defending kind of a pluralist racial perspective on doing research, right? Because you want to find all the racial disparities that are out there. It's not clear that's really the way you want to do treatment, right? So in the example that I use, notice that after they found the genotypes that were responsible for the differences, they didn't just say, hey, let's just give an extra round of chemotherapy to all these Native Americans. No, they said, look, let's see what kind of genotypes you have. And then if you have the genotype that's expected to be correlated to that difference in response, then we'll give you an extra round of chemotherapy. Right?
Okay, there was one more question, but that person has, I think, generously decided to ask their question over a drink. Quayshawn, thank you for a fascinating lecture. I think one of the things that I particularly like you mentioned is how, you know, you had a view as a philosopher and you went into a science course and you change your mind, right? And that is exactly what the Salvi Project is about, to foster these connections between philosophy and the healthcare and healthcare sciences broadly concerned, precisely because both sides can learn so much from each other. And I think in the end, good work comes from input on both sides. But with that, I want to once again thank the Peter Sowerby Foundation for the generous endowment. I want to thank King's for hosting us. I want to thank you all, including our online audience, for coming here. We have a very short evaluation that I hope I can ask you to fill out. But Rivka, how will people do this?
So sorry, there's going to be a really easy QR code in about a second.
There's going to be a QR code up in about a second. So please, either before or even during your drink, QR code it and let us know what you thought so we can do more events and better events in future. And all that rests me now to do then is to thank our speaker very much for such a fantastic talk.